I think an infinite Turing machine could probably compute more than us. They're probably not infinite.
Okay, that's what goes on air. William said, Turing machine can compute more than us.
I think we think too highly of ourselves.
Oh no, we're arrogant. Humans are arrogant. Okay, with that introduction, theories of consciousness by TJ.
Great, thanks, Sergey. Just for some housekeeping, are you all seeing my full screen, or is there like a bar to the right?
There is no bar to the right. There is a green bar as an element of design.
Great.
On the bottom.
Great. That's just, I can see your faces. I cannot see the chat, so if anybody does post in the chat, please feel free to chime up. This is meant for more of an overview of the review, so please feel free to chime in. I can do my best to answer some of the questions. I know this is definitely going to be a little bit ambiguous at times because a lot of this is definitely more narrative in theory than actually hard-pressed in any kind of data science or any kind of empirical results. But just to go over the authors quickly, Anil Seth is a British professor of cognitive and computational science at University of Sussex. He is one of the main contributors to this field, and especially he's the editor-in-chief of Neuroscience of Consciousness. Tim Bain is also a professor of philosophy at Monash University in Australia. He's associated with Mind, Open Mind, and his current work would really emphasize trying to find a measure for consciousness. And so with that, the overview of this presentation is as follows. A lot of this is broken down into the sections of the paper. Since this is a very thick paper, we're going to start with NCCs, preliminaries, and just sort of go through these large four postulates on sort of what consciousness might be. We got HOTS, GWTs, IITs, and then some reentry and predictive theory tasks. They go further into sort of evaluating the differences between the theories, and that's where we're going to get into the meat of this discussion, and then some suggestions moving forward. So starting off, we have the neural correlates of consciousness, where here is just the minimal set of neural events that might be jointly sufficient for a conscious state. This approach really prioritized the search for correlates between brain activities and consciousness. It's really a theoretical approach instead of focusing on explanatory links between neural mechanisms and aspects of consciousness. That really being said, theorists often employ different conceptions of what it would really take to secure an explanatory link between neural activity and consciousness. Some really assume that the theories of consciousness should and can close the explanatory gap, where here the explanatory gap is the intuition that there seems to be no prospect of fully reducing explanation of experience in physical system terms. Others doubt or remain really agnostic to whether the explanatory gap will ever really be fully closed, but nevertheless, this hope for a framework that might explain certain aspects of consciousness, and in doing so, reduce or eliminate the sense of mystery surrounding this biophysical basis. Other theorists really argue that explanatory gap intuitions are misleading and should not be taken seriously in some science of consciousness. And so the whole field really is divided almost on every single aspect that I'm going to try to explain here. And the paper does give reference to both sides with many different reviews. So if you do find one of these points salient or misleading, you can absolutely go into the paper and find those other sources. But notably, instead of theory of consciousness progressively being ruled out as empirical data accumulates, many theorists seem to be proliferating. With this proliferation has lent itself both to attempts to integrate existing theories with one another and the development of adversarial collaborations, meaning which components competing theories agree in advance about whether an outcome of a proposed experiment will support or undermine a preferred theory. Our attention is really restricted to theories that are expressed in neurobiological terms or are plausible to entail claims that can be expressed in neurobiological terms. So that's in contrast to things such as quantum mechanic processes and links directly to other theories of metaphysical theory. And so here we're definitely trying to find that neurobiological component. With that, in the 90s, where the neurobiological paradigm sort of starts with this presentation, David Clambers really said there are two different problems. One where the easy problem is the functions and behaviors that are associated with consciousness, and others that are the more hard problem that concern the phenomenal or the subjective in terms of where the dimensions of consciousness are. So within these theories, the hard problem is really a question of trying to figure out whether or not you can get to this explanatory gap. And sometimes people call this the real problem of consciousness, but it is still greatly argued. The grip of the hard problem may really loosen as our capacity to explain and predict and then control the phenomenological and functional properties of consciousness expands. So as we keep developing theories, trying to compare and contrast, sometimes this hard problem might get away from us and or it might be better defined over time. And so that's sort of the hope of a lot of these theorists as they continue to publish and give more rise to this. But just going through the last part of this, one of the critical questions is whether or not the hard problem is actually indeed a genuine challenge, or it should be viewed as sort of a discovery within other experiments and ought to be dissolved rather than solved. And so a lot of people are trying to disprove it as well as prove it. And so there are definitely two camps on both sides. But with that,
can I interrupt with a question back on that last slide? So what do you mean by dissolve the question? So say that that phenomenal experiences of consciousness don't exist, or what exactly does that entail?
Some camps do believe that it is a consequence of consciousness rather than a neurobiological basis for consciousness. So it's saying that like there's a subjective dimension of consciousness. They're saying that consciousness is more inherent than anything, and it should be dissolved rather than solved. Does that make sense?
Yeah, isn't that just kind of putting the hard problem down the road, though, saying that it's a consequence rather than a
yes,
neurobiological basis? And it's just certainly there's a causal link between some neurological basis and whatever phenomenal experience one would have. It's a good question of whether or not it's possible to untangle that entirely, but
yeah,
I don't entirely see what you would gain by dissolving the problem. Just sort of saying, oh,
well,
there are camps.
Yeah, so there are some camps, and we'll get into this as well, that believe that consciousness is a unified mechanism of nature instead of some dimensionality of it. And so they're trying to state that consciousness is sort of like a given rather than some kind of hierarchy. And so they're trying to argue the former rather than the latter.
All right.
Cool. Great. So going into sort of more definitions on what the review hoped to get, really it's the issue of experience or subjective awareness. One of the many reasons why theories of consciousness talk past each other within their theories often have to do with different explanatory targets. So the authors in this paper really want to account for with theories that often disagree with this kind of phenomena that theories of consciousness should explain. There is a something as it is for an organism to be conscious. In something it is like are both phrases that sort of surmise the ambiguity of what they're trying to explain in terms of explanatory targets. And so what this essentially means is what it's like to be one state of consciousness, which would differ from what it is like to be in another state of consciousness. A comprehensive theory of consciousness should explain why some organisms or systems are conscious where others are not. And then it should also explain why states of consciousness differ from each other in ways that they do. So for example, the fact of looking at a cup of coffee, I can explain what it is, but it might have a different state if I give a representation of the coffee in my mind. Those could potentially be different forms of consciousness. And so there's arguing that general theory of consciousness should explain both. Here we can get more and more granular as classes of consciousness states. Global states concern really an organism's overall subjective profile and are associated with changes in arousal and behavior. Yes.
Maybe it's just me, but like I still don't like when you jump to classes of consciousness. But I don't know yet what consciousness is. It's like
so
what
that
do you
it. So without giving away the punchline of this whole paper, they don't either. And so that's one of the main open challenges. And so everything here is really from a narrative perspective. And these are from different camps of narrative interpretation of what consciousness could theoretically be. Does that make sense?
Well, but it's just I got confused because like, okay, when I'm sedated, what does it mean to be conscious and sedated? And of course, I'm using a colloquial meaning. Following instructions, right? Does the patient follow instructions or they don't interfere? I'm sorry, I'm just trying to.
Yeah. So they really don't know either because they talk about different measures of more comprehension and the measurement problem. And so understanding even what a measure of consciousness is not even verified. And they don't have a great way of measuring it. There are some experiments within the four regimes that might lead to either like a front of the brain perception of the consciousness or a back of the brain perception of consciousness. But the real issue is that we don't really have an understanding of what consciousness is as a measure, nor will that help for any kind of brain altered states, infant or animal identification of consciousness.
No, but even philosophically, what do we mean by consciousness? Is that self-awareness? Or what
different people mean different things by that, right? That's the problem.
Well, yeah, can we just define, okay,
Well,
consciousness?
they're leaving it intentionally vague so that as they're building up this idea of what a theory of consciousness might look like, that is sort of meant to begin pushing into that vagueness. It's
Right. I think they're trying to start to define it, but the problem is they use so many camps and so many, like, I mean, decades of research on what people think it is, that it's hard to just say, well, let's define one thing that's the same, because all these camps want their thing obviously to be, they believe that to be the true. So if you want to kind of get them together, that probably takes years to define one.
It'd probably be against the spirit of this paper to start with a hard definition of consciousness and then evaluate it. Yeah,
it's hard to be like, oh yeah, there's different camps, but we say this,
Yeah.
which is kind of like immediately makes clear what you're.
No, but if there are different camps, you can like give the definition. See, the consciousness is self-awareness. One, consciousness is whatever spiritual feeling. Like what else? But like,
Yeah, but I think even within the camp, there's like hugely different opinions on what the exact way is you would phrase it, right? The whole problem of consciousness is that we don't know how to define it. Or like
Yeah,
that in
and it
general.
seems also we have like an anthropomorphic bias towards like our own consciousness, like I imagine probably most of these ideas are leading away from like the idea that like a bacteria is conscious or whatever.
Actually
The local
false.
states, yeah.
Well, hang on. Before everybody starts to go hypotheticals, to answer your question, because you all are sort of right and sort of wrong about the paper. Sergey, to answer your question, each regime has their own definition of what consciousness is, and I'll try to explain that. However, I think Brad said it, but there are camps that do believe that non-biological creatures are conscious as well, which I will try to explain.
One quick question. Is this like a binary definition? Like you either have consciousness or not have consciousness, or?
No, it's trying to state whether or not there are local states of consciousness, global states of consciousness, whether or not it can be phenomenal, functional, but it's in terms of either a granularity. Some say that there's universal consciousness, So it's just by the definition of the four paradigms. And I think as we get into it, maybe the comparing and contrasting will help with the discussion. And I can probably go through it a little more. We could maybe talk about the different aspects because there is a ton to this paper.
Yeah, let's let TJ go on. I think we'll end up talking for just an hour if we stuff too long.
Yeah.
Completely
And
agree.
just a comment on the protocol. Let's talk like one by one. Like it's just we don't start with a three-way conversation on this side. It's easy for us, but it's impossible for them.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Great. Yeah, no worries. So examples of just getting to the different definitions, they have sort of 6 different combinatorial things that they're trying to classify here with the global states, the local states. Global states meaning more wakefulness, dreaming, in all of the things that are listed. Different granularities in the local states are lower level perceptual features, up to perceptual scenes. So that is also a granularity that they're talking about. And then the single conscious scene surmises each of the agent's local states. Then they try to define more phenomenal properties, suggesting like the phrase what it is like, rather than functional properties concerning the role of the mental state. Questions of the local state are why an agent is at a certain local state, and can we measure that, or why a particular local state has the experimental character that it is rather than an experimental character of some other kind. So comparing the two states, or why it's on or off, is another question that they talk about. We're going into sort of the first higher orders theories of consciousness, specifically are represented in the context of I have a visual experience of moving a dot, would be sort of a meta representation. And here a meta representation is the mental representation that has a target to another mental representation. So it is trying to, for lack of a good analogy, transfer learn one representation to a lower order representation. They really differ from other theories that concern the account that they give the nature and the role of meta representations that are responsible for consciousness. So it's arguing more that nature is influencing this learned ability to go from one meta representation to another, to be able to say, I have a visual experience of a moving dot that is different than actually seeing a moving dot. And so it is concerned that the agent's own representation of the world rather than the world itself, which is why they add the meta in there. And so really the higher orders of theories rarely focus on global states of consciousness, but they do pose that with subjectivity reports and metacognition of trying to understand the higher order decisions within the visual system and the auditory system, about generating models of perceptual context, where perceptual reality monitoring posits that consciousness perception arises with higher order networks of even like first order representations. But a particularly intriguing question is whether, and if so, how these higher orders of theory explain the distinctive phenomenal characteristics of various kinds of experiences, why the phenomenal character associated with seeing a sunset is so different from the phenomenal character associated with a headache. Why are those so different? And they just sort of posit that philosophical question in this regime. But with respect to a neural basis of this consciousness, an emphasis is on the meta representation, which has really led higher order theorists to emphasize anterior cortical regions, especially the prefrontal cortex, given the association with these regions of cognitive functions. However, most higher order theories propose that anterior involvement is implicated in consciousness, as there is a disagreement on precisely whether anterior regions or processes are required for these meta representation lower order learning. And so that's sort of the first regime. The second regime is the global workspace theory. Here it is organized in sort of a like a blackboard architecture, much like, yeah,
TJ,
much, yes.
I have a question regarding the previous one, higher order theory.
Sure.
So is it So do they talk about how analytically, so the method that, for example, we have a high order representation of the brain, so they cannot essentially explain consciousness if they are lower order, and only higher order representation can do that?
I'm not sure. So what you're saying is if there isn't any lower order representation, you don't have consciousness. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, so for example, for example, in a network thing, right? If they have only pairwise things and nothing higher order emerged, so that thing cannot have consciousness, at least this consciousness.
Yeah, so
Or is
from
the
my
order,
yeah, so I guess from my understanding, it is concerned about representing a world rather than finding what the world is actually like. So it's saying I can think of a cup of coffee right now without actually having a cup of coffee in my hand. They're trying to get to the state of representing objects in information that we know from learned experiences into sort of a self-created world rather than the real world itself. Does that make sense?
yeah, okay.
So I
It's
think
like
you're still limited by the
it's like,
data and
yeah,
experiences that you have.
it's like introspection, maybe then things that happen inside.
Little, but I don't think they use that expression or definition anywhere in the paper. It might be good. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
So
Yeah.
like this may be a tangent, but is it spilling into this idea of like theory of mind or self-awareness when we start going into this, or is it just meta representation by itself?
It's more concerned with so I believe this specific regime, because it's not trying to explain everything about consciousness, it's more trying to explain why we have more locally identified representations of potential ideas or concepts within the world. So I don't think it's trying to do more global self-awareness, but it does lead, they did have a comment that I noted that although higher orders of theories proposed, actually, oh, sorry, here we go. That this theory really focuses on global states of consciousness, but it would be natural for them to appeal to the integrity of meta-representational processes to account for the distinctions between global states. So I do think that sort of when thinking about that, it is more evident of or like the idea of like self, if you're thinking about what a global representational state is. Does that answer your question?
Yes and no, but that's sort of the nature of the paper.
Yeah, sorry about that. But let's move on. So the global workspace of theory. So this is really much like Blackboard architecture, similar to AI, in which Blackboard is the central resource through which centralized processes share and receive information. So the first global workspace theory of consciousness was framed as in the cognitive level. It proposed that consciousness mental states are those that are globally available to a wide range of cognitive processes, including attention, evaluation, memory, and verbal report. The core claim of this theory is that it is widely accessible with information to such consumer cognitive systems that constitute conscious experience. So the basic claim is that been developed in neural theory, often referred to as the global neuronal workspace theory, which according to sensory information gains access to consciousness when it is broadcast with an anatomically widespread neuronal workspace that is implemented across higher order cortical association areas, with in particular, but not exclusively emphasizing the prefrontal cortex. So here there's a set of units, sort of like the paper that Aloy did several weeks ago, where there are units that could potentially be accessed by some ignition of an action or a sensorium. And so access to the global workspace is achieved through nonlinear networks of ignition, which is a recurrent process that amplifies and then sustains neuronal representation. Much like the higher order theories, this is focusing on the question of what makes representation conscious. And these theorists have really attempted to account for the phenomenological differences between different types of experience. And so they have an example throughout the paper of biocular rivalry, where you basically are presented two different objects on your vision, where one is a house and then the other is like a cat. And so why would you choose to observe the house and not the cat immediately, or observe the cat and not the house? And so what is potentially either conscious represented or unconsciously represented? And so they're trying to argue here that the representation aims to explain at any particular point in time, the mental state that you are currently in would correspond to the house is conscious, where the corresponding cat is unconscious, but offers really no direct account for experimental contrast between seeing either of them. They really don't have a tendency to focus on functional aspects of consciousness, but rather than phenomenal. And so, in fact, these are really explicitly proposed to accounts of consciousness access. That is, the accounts of why certain representations are available to be flexibly used in a wide range of consuming systems. And so, one important question raised by these theories concerns what exactly requires a workspace to qualify as global, that they don't really understand what this theoretical global space is, but that it is accessible to work with. And a lot of this is more designed for the prefrontal cortex. And so is the number and type of consuming systems to which the workspace can be broadcast that matters, or is it the broadcasting that occurs within the workspace the reason for the consciousness is an open question, or even if they're both important. And so this could be specifically important for brain damage, or people who've undergone brain split surgery. There have been accounts of people talking about this, non-human animals, and then even artificial systems people have postulated on. Yes.
This one and the previous one, although at the end you said systems, I was wondering, it mostly seems to be talking very much about the brain. But obviously there's also ideas that, larger systems of, smaller, animals, or maybe even trees and stuff have consciousness, maybe in more of like a group level.
Mm-hmm.
Do these theories, like, I can imagine that there's a meta representation that if you have a forest, for example, a forest can store like a meta representation in a way. If you think of a tree as a local processor or something.
Yes.
Do they talk about those things, like more like because groups of animals in some domains of like animal nature could potentially say they have on group levels like
I don't even think about slime molds and local representations of the hyphae as their as the
right,
slime mold
because
is
it seems to
expanding.
talk mostly about the brain, which makes sense, right? You need to narrow it down a little bit, otherwise it becomes
Right.
very, very, very big paper. But I was wondering if they talk about it at all, because you can imagine these both apply to maybe.
Yeah, so Alo, to answer your question, this paper was very distinct on trying to limit their scope, specifically because of this wide-ranging of theoretical basis of consciousness. They really wanted to stay on the neural basis and potentially stay within human brains, because that's what a lot of people have been writing about within the last 3 decades. But you're correct in terms of even birds have some level of global consciousness. Even when they're flying around, we've seen birds transfer and they just automatically do that. And that's been shown in different avian studies. But they do talk, and specifically in this next theory, they talk about how this global consciousness actually can arise even from non-animal humans, or non-human animals, and even non-biological systems as well. So I think that answers your question.
On this point, I want to interrupt by raising my hand. You can't see me probably.
Sure.
Basically, like this is like a neuroscience centric group, but we do have computer scientists in here. So like, I think it'd be interesting to see something like this, like a paper that's addressing similar concepts, but from a more mathematical perspective, not a neurocentric perspective. It's like, basically, like my imagination says that if you took away these pictures of the brain and tried to formulate this mathematically, it wouldn't be that hard. But like, it's just they're not doing it.
So it actually leads greatly into this next theory, because this is all from starting from a different place and is not concerned with a biological foundation. It actually comes from a mathematical approach to characterize the phenomenology. This theory really starts by proposing axioms about the phenomenological characteristics of the conscious experience. That is, the properties that are taken to be self-evidently true and to apply to all the possible forms of consciousness. So a very combinatorial problem. And then have these axioms as it derives claims about the properties of any physical substrate of consciousness that it describes. So it's an integrated information system, which in turn is associated with information theoretically quantified by this symbol phi here. And so which measures, broadly speaking, how much information is generated by a system as a whole compared to its parts that are considerably independent. And so here the IIT really links consciousness primarily with posterior cortical areas, the so-called posterior hot zone, emphasizing parietal, temporal, occipital areas in which the grounds that the areas exhibit neuroanatomical properties that are supposedly well suited to generate high levels of integrated information. So trying to think of those integrated information type things from a computer science standpoint, it's like, what information can we glean from specific areas to use as resources to combine to find some measure phi as a conceptual structure to make this experience. And so really in contrast with the first two, it's associated with consciousness with aspects of cortical information processing, that is functional descriptions of what a system does. This theory does not refer to information processing per se, but instead links consciousness to properties of intrinsically cause and effect structure of a system, namely the causal power of a system to influence itself. So according to this theory, any system that generates a non-zero maximum of integrated information is conscious to at least some degree. And so because of this, this theory would imply that already non-biological systems are conscious. This is reasonably comprehensive. It really accounts for both global states and local states of consciousness. So here, the global states are the quantity of irreducible information generated by a system. And so this is the measure phi. And so it encourages a unidimensional conception of the global states, but it equates to the organism's level of consciousness within this value. The local states can be understood by a conceptual structure, which this system, they call it shapes in dimensional space, that is specified by mechanisms of the cause and effect structure. These shapes underpin the kind of phenomenal characteristics of the experience. And so for the example that they give, the spatial nature of a visual experience has been related to the cause and effect structure specified by the grid-like mechanisms in early visual cortex. And so the global unity or utility of consciousness is explained by the integrated aspects of integrated information. So it's the association of information generated as the whole over the above generated parts. And so just to get into some of the biocular rivalry examples, this theory would explain that the subject would report experiences of a house rather than the cat by applying the hypothesis that the complexity underlying the reported association with the conceptual structure corresponding to the content of the house is what is being processed rather than the content of the cat. And it explains the experiential contrast between seeing the house and seeing the cat as the shape and corresponding to the conceptual structure. Even though that it is very robust and it comparatively has little to do with consciousness and relating how to deal with other aspects of the mind, such as attention. It doesn't really do very well learning and memory. It doesn't have great theory for and not yet focused on the relevance of embodiment of environmental embeddings for consciousness, where the first two theories said they would. And so going on a little bit, just in terms of time, the last is reentry and predictive processing theories. And so these are two top-down approaches where they emphasize the shaping and embedding of conscious perception. The first reentry theories are motivated by neurophysiological evidence revealing the importance of top-down signaling for consciousness, and usually this is derived by the visual perception. And in one prominent reentry theory, local recurrency theory, the authors of this theory emphasize that recurrence or reentrant processing within perceptual cortices is sufficient to give rise to consciousness, given that the integrity of other enabling factors such as the brainstem arousal, but that the parietal and frontal regions might be required to reporting the contents of perceptual experience or drawing upon these for decision making. Is one of the reasons why they were drawn to this is because of the cause of sensory signals, and really the free energy problem, which appeals to the fundamental constraints regarding control and regulation that apply to all systems. Briefly, the free energy problem is trying to understand how we can keep a stable state in a chaotic system, and what we potentially do to minimize that or find a loss for that. And so some of these predictive processing, such as active inference, and add the notion of sensory prediction error, which might minimize this fact by updating some of the predictions by performing actions about the sensory data, in contrast to sort of the mere empirical correlations with the neural correlates of consciousness. And so that gets to the predictive processing theories, which is not a theory of consciousness, but is there to help informally address the local conscious states in terms of a consent top-down perceptual predictions. So for this particularly, it can be explained by distinctions between conscious and unconscious states and whether a mental state is part of a current best guess or optimal posterior during a perceptual inference. So a lot of this is kind of like a self-learning recurrent neural net going through an experience. And so that's why you sort of see these connections between this prediction error in the canonical circuit here that they have.
So I have a question regarding this. So if we do not have any sensory system, none of our sensory system works, right? They are dead, right? So we cannot be conscious then based on this.
Well, you still have to interpret. You have to still take in the world. So how do we get any information from the true world versus like the world that we create for ourselves, like a global idea of what a world is? You still have to have sensory information to be able to do that, or some kind of signal coming in to be able to interpret it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but I remember there are systems, and we know there are systems that they do not need any input to essentially generate internal system. They can essentially still make a word for themselves. So what you are saying essentially, if we don't get any sensor, we cannot build a representation. Maybe we cannot build a representation of the word, but we can build a representation of something. Then does that count as consciousness or no? That's
so they're arguing that consciousness is a fact of sort of the observations being able to be used as a recurrent net to build better representations of itself, at least with this theory. Okay. So I do agree that it is kind of conflicting, and there are so many like counterpoint references. You might be touching on one of them, so I'm sorry I don't have more information about that part.
Yeah.
TJ.
Yeah.
It still feels like it's a very binary definition. It's like there's like two sets, and then I mean, no matter how you want to define those two sets, but it just feels like in all these you can define them slightly differently, what the set is.
Yes.
And what it isn't. But yeah, so there's, I mean, I guess I don't even know why you would maybe even get like some sort of gradient, but yeah, I don't know. I mean, how can we mathematically model something if it's a binary there or not binary? That's where I'm trying to sort of grapple my head around.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think for their intents and purposes is they try to narrow the, especially researchers within this field and theorists in this field try to narrow the scope to a binary conclusion, because if they can find on and off states of what is conscious, what is not conscious in a local state to make like a surmise to the global state, they could potentially lead to better identification of brain injuries, potentially developmental for infants who are still conscious, but they might have some lack of development of what those local states might be, or even non-biological states like artificial intelligence or other things that I can't think of an example for right now. But I do agree
So
that
basically, maybe have like multiple different questions or definitions of consciousness, and then if you tick maybe like 7 of them, then you're like super conscious. Whereas like maybe trees, while they can respond and stuff, they're, you know, tick maybe like 3 boxes of the 7 or whatever.
yeah.
I'm right. I would say that when I think about this problem, you know, it's kind of like picking colors off of a spectrum, right? You can look at the spectrum of color and say at one end, okay, red, orange, but ultimately, if you set a line, you're going to be, you know, dividing real numbers, and you're going to be arbitrarily sort of boxing in parts of that spectrum. So you, when talking about consciousness, I think it's a similar sort of effort. You talk about degrees, areas on the spectrum, you arbitrarily place bounds because that's what we do as people, but it's you know, ultimately still going to be necessarily breaking up
You just belong to that continuous camp. That's it. Just admit it.
I do. No, I totally do. I mean, biology is continuous, right? The world is continuous. So
I would say that there are some arguments, there are some people argue that actually that is not the case. We do not actually know that if the world as itself is continuous or discrete. And some people argue that we never actually can know, because if we are in a discrete world, right, we actually cannot know if it is discrete or not. We never can know that. And they say that
it's a different discussion.
Yeah, the one I love. Yeah.
No, but I'm saying that
Even
it's
in
actually,
continuous world.
I think it is related to here because it's about the scale, right? Because I think that comparing a scale of consciousness of a human being to all 9 billion human is you cannot compare. The scale matters, and for that continuous thing, the scale is what determines. Because if you go down in the scale, you might reach a place that, well, it is binary or it is discrete, but at higher levels, it doesn't matter because at that level is almost continuous, but we never know. I'm saying that is why I think it's related to here, because the scale matters, right? It's super consciousness might exist at a very high scale, while in low scales, in cell scales, we do not have something like super consciousness as people.
Yeah, these are definitely all great points, and I honestly think because in almost every single one of these caveats, they're like, see reference for dissent or see reference for alternative approach. So I do know that most of these are controversial, and they have definitely camps within each of the theorists' regimes. Yeah, but you all bring up very interesting questions. In terms of time, I will say we haven't even gotten to the meat of this yet.
TJ, you got 10 more minutes to solve what the human soul is. So good luck.
Yeah, so I have 3 slides that pretty much are like this, where it's very thick in terms of many different kinds of evaluations of these theories. And so kind of going through some of them, the structure of the consciousness and the utility of consciousness. They have lots of examples, and I'll post the slides later as well, because I have a lot of different examples from the text, what some of these are in contrast to. But a lot of the structure of consciousness and utility of consciousness, the IIT places considerable emphasis on this sort of utility. Whereas like the global workspace doesn't explicitly do this, but with the broadcasting function, it does place sort of this idea of utility. HOTS and reentry don't but they're more ambivalent to this the relationship of utility. But one thing that is inherent to IIT is that consciousness is unified, and it is more intrinsic to all of nature. And so because of that, they even argue that atoms can potentially be conscious. And so is this necessarily a good constraint? Is it not? It's part of it. Neural data constraints. They have argued, they've studied this over and over again, but the cerebellum is neither necessarily nor sufficient for consciousness. By itself, it cannot be conscious due to its structure, lack of being able to process higher orders of information, and due to different lesion tests and access to other parts of the brain by turning that off in various animal studies. Here, we sort of argue that any of these theories should be able to explain that, but IIT is probably one of the more better architectures, or is not implied that it is conscious because the architecture is poorly suited. And then the three other theories sort of lack really why the cerebellum would not be more associated with their theories as well. Moving on, there's a front of the brain and the back of the brain debate. A lot of this has to do more with the neurobiology, where they're trying to do this binary operation, like Amrit's sort of getting at the heart of, where they're trying to see whether or not they can disambiguate between conscious states and unconscious states. They do different lesion tests. There's advocates of the HOT and the GWT's appeal to findings where they have that over the competing theories, but whereas the IIT and reentry theories that the observed prefrontal activity is a consequence of consciousness, although they might be more because it's you're talking about giving more explanatory and executive control of the brain that would then switch between or using both back and forth. And so there's debates whether or not the anatomical boundaries where the prefrontal cortex lies. So there's even debate on whether or not it's going to be front or back. And then there's a disagreement about the relationship between conscious and cognitive access. Novel prediction. So many of the most significant events in history of science have involved confirmation of novel predictions. They give the example of special relativity, going into some of the implications of that theory, and how that it might be necessary for us to use that. But this is extremely difficult to test. And so they have a couple of different experimental results that I can't, due to time, I can't really talk about very much, but there are further evidence potentially for reentry in IIT to account for some of this novel prediction. And then IIT has sort of this idea that if you can change the neural structure, could change the conscious experience, even when this doesn't change in neural activity. So I think here what they're saying is that if you sort of have a different neural structure, but you are giving the same idea of this house and cat and are still performing the cat, or giving the house example as your conscious state, it could potentially lead to the theory of IIT being betterly or more emphasized as the correct one. Temporal proliferating, people have tried to do event-related mechanisms, especially in electrophysiological recordings. They talk about early negativity of the awareness negativity response, which is another experiment that they had talked about, had been found in both vision and audiation. It does favor IIT and local reentry, but it's still debated. Other theorists argue that there is a much later onset to perceptual consciousness, whether or not there is this ignition, or there should be an ignition state somewhere and they're not finding it, or it just takes either longer to get that access to the higher order processes. And so there's still debate on the temporal proliferating. Lastly, just to wrap us all up, and then maybe we could talk for a couple minutes, these narrative structures are within the science of consciousness. There's really not a lot of evidence for a lot of these things. There are people trying a lot of very interesting things in terms of sleep-awake, in rapid eye movement tests with the saccadic eye movements and different types of flash responses when measuring different neural activities. But really what needs to happen is that they need to be developed with more precision, more comprehension, and then figure out how to deal with the measurement problem, which is the most critical, especially for verification of any of these predictions. And with that, that is my presentation, but down to talk for a couple minutes.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, great presentation, PJ.
Yeah,
I have a comment to put, even though I started this with a joke about the 21 grams, thanks to Octave. But think about, forget about consciousness for a moment and think about another apparently super vague term, schizophrenia. So there are also many theories of schizophrenia, and we don't even look at them when we do our work, but it would be nice to at least, and I'm not criticizing anything about consciousness, but with schizophrenia, we can at least operationalize the definition. Like we have a disorder, debilitating effect, and we want to cure or at least move away a person from this debilitating effect. But the approaches and the state is kind of similar, it seems, right?
Yeah, but I think schizophrenia is also more defined by the symptoms, whereas consciousness is very hard to define by any symptoms. Like if you move your arm, are you conscious? Like, you know, it's like
schizophrenia is largely, last time I heard, is just defined whether you're functional in the human world or not.
I mean, there is a definition in the psychiatric books. I mean, there's no, it's just based on symptoms. You have external and internalizing symptoms, schizophrenia, and they're both associated with the symptom.
Yeah, and I mean, and I really hate to use these terms because they're not like super offensive, because they're like kind of super offensive, but they have like high functioning versus low functioning, autism, schizophrenia, depression, lots of stuff. So like everything's got a degree to it.
Right, no, but I mean more like the way we, at least for our work with like the binary prediction, whatever, that's all just based on symptoms and like a doctor saying like, oh, this person does and this person doesn't have schizophrenia. But I think that's much harder for consciousness as well. I think I agree that we have theories around how the brain, how it's different in the brain. That's like a huge issue, and I think is probably up there with like trying to understand consciousness, because I think like things like schizophrenia are so complex to understand from like a brain perspective. But I mean, if you're defining it, currently we're just defining it in a very symptomatic way, which is much harder for consciousness because we don't even know, we have associated these symptoms with a word, schizophrenia, but for consciousness, we don't even know what we want to, like, we don't even know what the symptoms are in the first place.
I disagree, we sort of do, right? We get at least take Wittgensteinian approach and look at how people use the word consciousness. And
no, sure, but some people say trees are conscious, some people say only humans are conscious. I mean, there's like a hugely debate about that. Whereas schizophrenia, we have a much better frame, because at some point people are like, hey, why is this person behaving this way? And we got to give it a name. I mean, that's.
I think even Wittgenstein would say that our language game is a little bit too convoluted around consciousness right now.
No, to the word consciousness and like to many other words. That's what I'm saying. Like schizophrenia to a degree, maybe a lesser degree, and that's why.
No, I agree with you that there's a lot of theories in the brain. I just mean more like, I think the definition currently, which is also very hard, is mostly based on like, behavior and like.
It is based on behavior, but it's the definition, but then the theories abound.
Right, yeah, exactly.
And
No, exactly.
so how do you, like, if you think this is too spooky and consciousness, then, but you're kind of interested in that direction. Theories of schizophrenia, I think our center needs more like mathematizing those theories. But it's still, Like, so, sorry, just to finish on that note, TJ, but it's like we're in a sort of even pre-phlogiston era of science there, right? Oh, there is this
I think there's,
thing.
I think the problem is a little bit that like.
Is this even science? I feel that it's not even started to become science.
Are
We are
these
before
falsified?
that.
That's the question. I mean, like.
We are before that.
Why is Popper god of science? Why does he
Yeah, I would
to
say it's
define what is science?
It's
or not?
philosophy of
No.
science, I would say more than, yeah.
No, but
I
I
don't know.
mean,
I think science is anything you can ask a question. You don't necessarily, can answer it. Otherwise, we would have already answered everything. And if I can ask the question, then it's science. So I don't know.
But we don't have methodology yet.
Well, so TJ is talking in the chat in defense of these theories, that there is a bit of empirical work that's been done to back them, but we haven't, we didn't go over it. TJ thinks, what, will you go on why you think it's an ill-defined problem,
So-
TJ?
What I meant as it is science, I thought I was talking about, is it the paradigm shift has happened, or it is before the era of that we have, because all of these things, all of these four paradigms, each of them explain a set but cannot explain the other one. And that is actually how in, for example, a structure of a revolution of science, that is how they define it. They say people have different ideas, different camps. That's what I meant, that it still hasn't, everyone hasn't managed to get behind one framework. That's what I meant, that it's not, it's before the essentially the revolution, if the revolution happens here. So because they say that before that, it's not actually science. It's before Newton, it wasn't science. After Newton, it was science. That's what I meant.
Poor Galileo, but I disagree.
Poor Leibniz, yeah.
No. That is some UK colonial bullshit.
Yeah.
No. There was science from the get-go. You can talk to
I'm talking about
Science is
the-
like
I'm
consciousness has degrees. Well, anyways, let me stop the recording. I think this is I'm stopping the record. This is a happy